Steel, Oil, and Justice, A Tale of Two Titans, Episode 3. Welcome, listeners, to Orbits and Oracles, a Griot's Guide to History, where we navigate history's celestial movements and prophetic echoes, tracing the paths of power, resistance, and transformation. In this episode, Steel, Oil, and Justice, in this third episode of Steel, Oil, and Justice, we will step into the turbulent era of industrial expansion and political upheaval. Through the voices of those who shaped the nation, we uncover the forces that built industries, challenged oppression, and clashed over the soul of America. As you are listening, you are, of course, required to take notes focusing on the following key events, key figures, and key legislature. At the end of this episode, as always, I will pose a few reflective questions to deepen your understanding. Be sure to jot down your thoughts and prepare to engage in discussion. If you'd like to follow along, the full script for this podcast is linked in your episode. If you have any questions, please remember to ask three before you ask me. Now, let's align ourselves with the past. Chart the constellations of history and listen to the voices that built and battled for America's future. Prologue. The end of Reconstruction and the return of the Old South. By 1877, Reconstruction had collapsed. The promise of 1877 saw Rutherford Hayes become president in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Without protection, Black Americans were left to the mercy of white supremacist laws and violence. Booker T. Washington, a young educator, saw the shift with concern. Frederick Douglass fought for our freedom, but now they take it back inch by inch, he lamented. What good is freedom if a black man cannot vote, if he cannot work without fear? Meanwhile, W.E.B. Du Bois was watching the slow erosion of rights, foresaw a long fight ahead. We must demand our rights, he insisted. Washington preaches patience, but patience will not unshackle us. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the rise of industrial power. As Reconstruction ended, a new war began, labor versus capital. On July 14th of 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages for the third time in a year. Furious, workers walked off the job and the strike spread like wildfire. Cities like Baltimore to St. Louis erupted in riots. Trains were derailed, rail yards set ablaze. Cornelius Vanderbilt, an aging railroad magnate, sneered at the unrest. They think they can dictate to us. Railroads built this country. We are the backbone of progress. J.P. Morgan, watching, shook his head. This chaos disrupt business. The federal government must intervene or we will lose control. President Hayes, fearing anarchy, sent federal troops to crush the strike. More than 100 workers were killed, but the strike proved that organized labor was a force to be reckoned with. Immigration and the struggle for inclusion. As industry grew, so did the number of immigrants arriving in America. They poured in from Ireland, Germany, China, and Italy seeking opportunities but facing discrimination. In 1881, a fierce debate erupted between labor leaders over immigration. Dennis Kearney, an Irish born demagogue, had built his political influence in California by blaming economic woes on Chinese laborers. In a heated gathering in San Francisco, Kearney stood before a crowd of angry white laborers. "These Chinese coolies take the bread from our mouths," Kearney shouted. "They work for starvation wages, live like rats, and drive honest white men to ruin. We must expel them." Across the country in New York, Samuel Gompers, leader of the newly formed American Federation of Labor, took a different stance. "The real enemy is not the Chinese worker," Gompers argued in a meeting with labor leaders. "It is the capitalists who exploit all workers, white, black, or immigrant alike. The fight is against corporate greed, not the foreigner." Despite opposition, Kearney's message gained traction. He found allies in Senator John F. Miller of California, who introduced legislation to ban Chinese immigration. The assassination of President Garfield. James A. Garfield, a reform minded president, took office in March of 1881. He promised to fight corruption, angering political bosses. On July 2nd of 1881, as Garfield walked through a Washington train station, a disgruntled office seeker, Charles Goutier, shot him twice. "I am stalwart. Arthur will be president," Goutier declared as he was arrested. Garfield lingered for 11 weeks, finally dying on September 19th of 1881. Chester A. Arthur, a product of the corrupt machine, surprisingly took up Garfield's fight, pushing through civil service reform with the Pendleton Act of 1883, which required government jobs to be awarded on merit rather than patronage. Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, 1881. Tuskegee, Alabama, a new approach to Black freedom. By the 1800s, Jim Crow was law. Black Americans had lost their political power, and white violence had returned in full force. The South had won, but a young Booker T. Washington had other ideas. Tuskegee Institute was founded in 1881, and Washington was chosen as its leader. His goal? Train Black Americans in trade and self reliance. One evening, Frederick Douglass visited Washington in Alabama. "Mr. Washington, I admire your efforts," Douglass said, but his voice carried concern. "Yet I worry that focusing only on education will not be enough. Without political power, we remain at the mercy of white lawmakers." Washington nodded. He respected Douglass, but he had a different vision. "Sir, we cannot force white America to give us full equality. Not yet," Washington replied. "But if we prove our economic value, if we build our own businesses, our own schools, our own institutions, then they will have no choice but to respect us." Douglass frowned. "But at what cost? Will you tell our people to accept second class citizenship?" Washington's jaw tightened. "For now, we must survive. If we demand too much, we risk losing everything." They sat in silence. Two men, two strategies, one goal: Black freedom. The passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. By the early 1880s, America's booming industries relied heavily on immigrant labor. Among the most targeted workers were the Chinese, who had come in large numbers to build the Transcontinental Railroad, work in mines, and fill labor shortages in the West. Despite their contributions, they were met with hostility, particularly from white laborers who accused them of driving down wages and taking jobs. The loudest voice against Chinese immigrants was Dennis Kearney, an Irish born labor leader who rallied white workers in California with fiery speeches. The Chinese must go, he bellowed at a rally in San Francisco. They undercut our wages. They take the food from our children's mouths. This is our land, and we must take it back. Across the country, labor leaders like Samuel Gompers, the head of the newly forming American Federation of Labor, viewed things differently. He saw capitalists as the true enemy, not immigrant workers. It is the bosses, not the Chinese, who exploit us, he said to his supporters in New York. The divide between workers only weakens our fight for fair wages and conditions. The fight is not against men of different races, but against those who hoard the wealth produced by our labor. Despite Gumper's arguments, Kearney's anti Chinese movement gained momentum, reaching the ears of Senator John F. Miller of California, who introduced legislation to ban Chinese immigration. In a heated Senate debate, Miller made his case. The Chinese are unfit for assimilation into American society. They do not intermarry. They do not adopt our ways. This law is necessary to preserve the purity of our race and protect American labor. A few senators opposed the bill, arguing that it violated the nation's principles. One senator from Massachusetts, George Frisbee Orr, stood against it. Are we not a nation that welcomes the oppressed? He asked the chamber. Have we not always prided ourselves on being a beacon of liberty? To exclude an entire race is to deny the very values upon which this country was built. But Orr's protests were drowned out. A faded conversation, Senator Miller and a Chinese merchant. In the days leading up to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a well respected Chinese merchant, Wang Laowa, secured a meeting with Senator John Miller in Washington, D.C. Wang had lived in San Francisco for over a decade, running a successful tea and silk business. With him was Chi Ji Yi, a railroad contractor who had hired hundreds of Chinese laborers to build the very railroads that now transported American goods across the continent. The two men were led into Miller's office, where the senator barely looked up from his desk. Wang Hua cleared his throat. Senator Miller, I have come to speak on behalf of my people. The Chinese have labored for this nation. We built your railroads. We worked your mines. We have started businesses, contributed to the economy. Miller cut him off with a wave of his hands. Yes, yes, you have worked, but at what cost? You accept wages lower than any white man would, and in doing so, you drive our own workers to ruin. The people demand action, and I will not deny them. Chen Ji Yi stepped forward. We did not come here to take money from any man's mouth. We came to work, to build a better life, just as the Irish, the Germans, the Italians have done. Yet only we are marked with exclusion. Milner leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. You do not wish to assimilate. You live in enclaves, speak your own tongue, refuse to embrace American customs. Wang shook his head. Yes, we do not assimilate, yet you refuse us citizenship. You say we do not intermarry, but your laws forbid it. You say we live apart, yet where can we go when mobs burn our houses? Miller's lips pressed into a thin line. The people have spoken, he said coldly. It is not about hatred. It is about preserving American jobs, American values. Chen He's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with fury. America was built by men like us. just as much as by men like you. Miller did not reply. The next day, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. On May 6 of 1882, President Chester A. Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law. It barred Chinese laborers from immigrating into the United States for 10 years. It denied citizenship to existing Chinese residents, and it prohibited Chinese immigrants from re entering the country if they left. The impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The law devastated Chinese communities already living in America. Chinese laborers who had built railroads and worked in factories were now targets of violence and discrimination. Employers fired them, refusing to hire Chinese workers even when labor was needed. Anti Chinese mobs burned down businesses, lynched Chinese workers, and forced entire communities into segregated districts like San Francisco's Chinatown. For white laborers, the law did little to improve conditions. Wages remained low, work remained grueling, and the power of industrial giants like Rockefeller and Carnegie continued to grow. The rich still ruled, the poor still suffered. The passage of Chinese Exclusion Act marked the first time in US history that immigration was banned on the basis of race and nationality, a precedent that would influence future immigration policies for decades to come. The Pendleton Act of 1883, the end of the spoils systems. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with uncertainty in the months following President Garfield's assassination in 1881. His death at the hands of Charles Gautier, a deranged office seeker, had shocked the nation and cast a harsh light on the corrupt spoils system, a practice where political loyalty, rather than merit, determined government appointments. President Arthur, once a product of this very machine that had fueled his corruption, now found himself in an unexpected position leading the charge for reform. As the president settled into the White House, reformers George Pendleton, a Democratic senator from Ohio, and the Civil Service Commission pressured Arthur to take action. Mr. President, this system is broken, Pendleton declared in a private meeting. If we allow government offices to be sold to the highest bidder, we invite more incompetence, more corruption, and more violence, like what happened to Garfield. Arthur, who had once thrived under Senator Cockling's stalwart faction, sighed. He knew that his old political allies wanted him to preserve the spoils system. But Garfield's murder had changed everything. The people want reform, Arthur admitted. And perhaps for once, Washington should listen. Arthur's decision to support civil service reform enraged stalwarts, particularly Cockling, who had placed Arthur in power expecting loyalty. You owe your career to the machine, Arthur, Cockling growled in a heated exchange. If you betray us, you will be a man without a party. Arthur, once a loyal machine politician, stood his ground. This is bigger than politics, Roscoe. The spoils systems has rotted Washington at its core. The reform bill introduced by Pendleton in 1882 called for competitive exams for federal jobs rather than political favoritism, the establishment of civil service commission to oversee hiring, and protections that made it illegal to fire or demote government employees for political reasons. Though opposed by many powerful figures, the assassination of Garfield had stirred public outrage. Under immense pressure, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act on January 16, 1883. Arthur signed the Pendleton Act into law, stunning his former allies. Almost immediately, the act covered 10% of federal jobs ensuring that positions were filled based on merit and not loyalty. One New York newspaper proclaimed a victory for honesty in government at last. However, the law had unintended consequences, as political bosses could no longer hand out government jobs in exchange for loyalty. They turned to big businesses for campaign funding. In doing so, the alliance between corporations and politics deepened, setting the stage for the era of the robber barons. Arthur's legacy. By 1884, Arthur pushed for reform had cost him politically. The stalwarts abandoned him, and he failed to secure his party's nomination for re-election. But as he left office, Arthur had the satisfaction of knowing that he had helped clean up a broken system, leaving behind a government that for the first time valued competence over cronyism. The labor movement and the Haymarket Riot, 1886. By 1886, labor unions were growing stronger. The push for an 8-hour workday led to massive protests in Chicago's Haymarket Square on May 4th, 1886. Anarchists, including Albert Parsons and August Spies, called for action against capitalism. The workers must rise, Spies proclaimed. As police moved to break up the rally, a bomb exploded, killing 7 officers. Gunfire erupted. Dozens lay dead and wounded. The press blamed the anarchists, and 8 men were arrested, 4 of whom were later hanged. The Knights of Labor, already weakened, collapsed under the backlash, while Gumper's AFL survived by focusing on skilled labor. The struggle for control, regulation, and Native American policies, 1887. The year of 1887 was a turning point for both American industry and Native American communities, as the government took its first steps towards regulating the monopolistic railroads. It also pushed forward policies that threatened to erase Native American culture and sovereignty. The Interstate Commerce Act, the rise of regulation. The railroads had been kings of industry for decades, but by the late 19th century, farmers and small business owners had had enough. They were choked by high shipping rates, manipulated by powerful men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould, who ran their empires with little oversight. President Grover Cleveland, a firm believer in limited government intervention, reluctantly acknowledged the corruption and abuse. In a closed door meeting with Congress, he sighed as he addressed his advisors. The power of the railroads is undeniable, but the people demand fairness. If we do nothing, we invite rebellion. The result was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, the first federal law to regulate railroads. It required that shipping rates be reasonable and just, and established the Interstate Commerce Commission to oversee enforcement. But the railroad magnates were not so easily subdued. J.P. Morgan, a brilliant financier, saw the act as nothing more than a political gesture. Regulation? He scoffed. They will never enforce this properly. And if they do, we shall find another way to profit. Indeed, while the ICC was created, it had little power to truly challenge the railroads. Many within the government were still under the sway of industrial barons who had built the nation's infrastructure and filled campaign coffers. The Dawes Act, breaking Native American sovereignty. While Congress wrestled with the railroad question, another policy was quietly making its way through Washington, a bill aimed at reshaping Native American life forever. Since the days of President Andrew Jackson, The U.S. government had sought to control and remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands. But now, instead of waging war, they sought to erase Native identity through assimilation. On February 8th of 1887, the Dawes Act was signed into law. It broke up Native American reservations, dividing tribal lands into individual plots to be distributed to Native families. Any land left over was sold to white settlers. President Cleveland, addressing Congress, claimed the law was in the best interests of Native Americans. The Indian must be trained in ways of civilization, he declared. We offer them a path to self sufficiency. But for Native leaders like Sitting Bull and Geronimo, the Dawes Act was nothing more than another betrayal. Sitting Bull, ever defiant, warned his people. They want us to become farmers so that they can take the land. They say it is for our good, but it is for theirs. We do not need their laws. Meanwhile, Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, exhausted from years of struggle, shook his head at the new policy. They have taken everything from us. Now they tell us we must be like them. But how can a man live when he is forced to forget who he is? Despite resistance, the U.S. government pushed forward, and over the next decades, millions of acres of native land fell into the hands of white settlers and spectators. Native families, stripped of their communal ways of life, were forced into the alien system of individual ownership, while boarding schools stripped Native children of their culture, language, and traditions. An epilogue. A nation in transition. The year of 1887 marked a nation at odds with itself, balancing between regulation and unfettered capitalism, between justice and oppression. While the Interstate Commerce Act was a step towards reining in corporate greed, it was weak and toothless, allowing the railroad monopolies to thrive for years to come. The Dawes Act, meanwhile, devastated Native American communities, fracturing their lands and traditions under the guise of progress. For Grover Cleveland, business titans, and Native leaders, this was an era of power and struggle, a battle over who would control the land, the economy, and the future of America. And the fight was far from over. As workers fought for rights, industrial titans tightened their grip. John D. Rockefeller, the oil king, crushed competitors through ruthless tactics. Competition is wasteful, he declared. We must have order to business. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, mastered vertical integration, controlling every step of production. We must make steel as efficient as possible or perish, he said. J.P. Morgan, the banker, saw the future. Industry must consolidate. The strong must absorb the weak, he mused, orchestrating deals that made him one of the most powerful men in America. As 1890 dawned, the battle lines were drawn: labor versus capital, immigrants versus nativists, reformers versus the old guard. The struggle of the Gilded Age was far from over. Ah, I know, right? That episode was heavy. But we are almost done. Just one episode left in this series of Period 6 APUSH, and we'll have all of the major key events marked down. But in the meantime, you just journey through another episode of Steel, Oil, and Justice here on Orbits and Oracles, a Griot's Guide to History podcast, where history, prophecy, and legacy align. The echoes of the industry and justice still ripple through time, and it is up to us to make meaning of the past as we shape our future. So, right now, I want you to go ahead and take a moment to review your notes. Who stood out? What moments resonated with you? How did the laws of the land shift the trajectory of history? All right. Think about those. If you don't have those immediately in your note, thank God this is a podcast. You can always go back and start from the beginning. But before you do that, I want to make sure that you have your knowledge check questions down. They should already be appearing on the screen. As we are focusing on number one, who were the primary leaders of the labor movement during the Great Railroad Strike of 1887? And how did their actions reflect the tensions between workers and industrialists? Number two, what were the immediate causes and consequences of the Haymarket Riot of 1886? And how did it impact the labor movement in the United States? Number three, what were the main provisions of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882? And how did it reflect broader societal attitudes towards immigrants and race during the Gilded Age? Number four, how did the Dawes Act of 1887 aim to assimilate Native Americans? And what were its long term effects on Native communities and their sovereignty? Number five, how did industrialists like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie consolidate their power during the Gilded Age? And what strategies did they use to dominate their respective industries? All right. And for this episode, we only have one short answer question, and that is, what was the significance of the Pendleton Act of 1883? And how did it attempt to reform the spoils system in federal government hiring? As always, make sure that you are prepared to share your thoughts in our next discussion. Until next time, stay curious, stay critically thinking, and keep looking to the past to illuminate the path of forward. This has been Orbits and Oracles, a Creole's Guide to History. See you in the next episode.